Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest instalment of At Risk Global Risk Intelligence Team weekly brief. I'm Ross Hill, Director of Intelligence for the team, and each week we like to take you through a couple of things that we think are important or interesting for the week ahead or actually for a longer time period. Our first item today obviously continues to be the conflict in Ukraine. Russia has made some gains over the past week or so, although they've primarily been in the south of the country. But the reporting we're seeing suggests that offensives are being planned for Kiev, the capital, and Kharkiv, the second city. The Western assessments continue to say that Russia's invasion is not going to plan, although Russian President Vladimir Putin says it is on track, but it doesn't really seem to be that way. We are seeing some talks opening up about opening up humanitarian corridors for aid and refugees, but they're not agreed yet. The suggestion that humanitarian corridors might be put in place seems to indicate that we might be in for some kind of prolonged conflict, and we don't really see any substantive peace talks taking place at this point. Some reports we've seen based on a leaked Russian document do suggest that Russia is aiming for the conflict to kind of end before the end of June because of the internal pressures that it's creating, but it is a leaked document, and so we do need to be kind of careful of the credibility of that. And then at least in the short term, it really seems like a further escalation in fighting will take place. Vladimir Putin said that Russia's assault on Ukraine will actually only end when Ukrainians stop resisting and Russia's demands are met. So really what we want to do is kind of look at kind of the scenarios now for how the conflict may play out. The first one, a negotiated ceasefire, and in some respects you could kind of label this as a Ukrainian victory as well. This might be brought about by a stalemate in the conflict, and maybe kind of economic collapse and diplomatic isolation that we're seeing in Russia, that might lead to increased domestic discontent, that will put a lot of pressure on Putin to end the conflict. Other indicators of this are China making overt statements about Russia ending the conflict, or maybe actually China being involved in some kind of peace negotiations. Essentially what we would need to see in Ukraine and then domestically in Russia is enough pressure to force some kind of withdrawal and give really Putin some kind of face-saving way out, which looks quite difficult at the moment. Ukraine would probably have to accept some loss of territory, Crimea specifically, maybe some other regions as well. It would also have to agree to things like being a non-nuclear state. But Russia's demands are still in place at the moment for Ukraine not to join NATO. That's probably one of its primary kind of asks within any negotiations, and we don't see Ukraine kind of committing to that at this point. The next alternative scenario would be something like a prolonged conflict. That could be brought about in a couple of ways. One is just Ukraine keeps managing to hold out against Russian forces with support from the West, essentially with financing, military aid, and other aid. But it could also be that Russia could actually kind of take Kiev, install a pro-Moscow puppet type government. But in that scenario, Ukraine is unlikely to officially surrender, and may carry out some kind of insurgency or resistance type conflict. In this sort of scenario, again, Putin's position over time will become increasingly weak, with lots of internal pressures domestically around his popularity, which would be difficult for him. And that could, again, eventually lead to withdrawal, but that would be after a kind of, really quite a long period, thinking sort of in terms of like the conflicts in Afghanistan etc. The next one would be a Russian military victory, where they're able to basically take control of the entire country and put down any resistance that Ukraine may have. And then you sort of end up with this greater Russian Federation, for want of a better terminology, involving Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. That doesn't seem the most likely scenario at this point, but things are obviously changing very quickly. And then the last one, which is, in some respects the most dangerous scenario, is some kind of NATO-Russia conflict. That could be brought about in a couple of ways. There's lots of talks of no-fly zones, but it seems extremely unlikely that NATO would become involved in that because of the risk of being dragged into a conflict with Russia. So there could be some kind of miscalculation where Russia fires on a NATO country, either its military assets or the country itself, in an accidental way. But that may kind of drag into a conflict. But generally, when we see miscalculation, diplomatically they managed to resolve that, although we are in kind of quite a different situation. Also, if you look at the insurgency or resistance scenario with Ukraine fighting Russia in the longer term as a resistance movement, that potentially could be kind of staged from Poland. So we might end up in a scenario where Russia might look to target Ukrainian forces over the border in Poland that NATO could then perceive as an attack on one of its members. Thus is sort of engaging it in a conflict. And then the last kind of one that we've been seeing written about recently is, and it sort of undercuts most of the scenarios really, is that if Putin and Russia increasingly come under pressure in Ukraine, increasingly come under pressure domestically, they might feel in a position where they're forced to use some kind of nuclear weapon, more likely a lower yield version, of which Russia has many, with a kind of limited attack. But just on the basis of that and its implications regionally, it's likely that NATO or the West would feel like it needed to respond to that in some way with a similar sort of strike, and then we get sort of problems around escalation there. And I've seen quite a few think tanks now writing about that nuclear scenario playing out in that way, and so it definitely seems like it's on the policy agenda. It's at the moment, looking at all of those different scenarios, it's pretty difficult to identify which one is emerging. A couple of weeks into the conflict now, a prolonged conflict of some kind does seem increasingly likely at the moment. And then in terms of wider implications, so far we are seeing Russia increasingly isolated. Multiple businesses have withdrawn or stopped taking kind of new business in Russia, and even in areas that are not linked to sanctions. So, for example, Russian oil is not part of the sanctions at the moment. However, we know that people are basically just refusing to buy it. So we're kind of seeing these like self-imposed embargoes against Russia, which are increasingly damaging to the Russian economy, but also increasingly worrying for the global economy as well. But definitely an increasing risk of doing business in Russia, not only reputationally, but probably physically as well. Putin ordered the Kremlin to create a list of unfriendly states, entities, and actors last week. And we've seen a US basketball player arrested on charges of drug smuggling for having cannabis oil in her luggage. And so, you can see this kind of risk of arbitrary detention to Westerners kind of growing. And then just generally an increasing risk to Western businesses in Russia. The economy is becoming much more under stress. So Russia has a significant stake in the commodities markets, oil and gas, oil prices in particular rising rapidly, but also around food. Russia exporting a lot of wheat as well as fertilizers, and then Russia very important to the metals market as well. So the global economic outlook coming under pressure, it was still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we have the added risks from the conflict in Ukraine. And then with Russia so important to the food kind of supply chain, we are seeing increased risk of food riots in the coming months. According to the UN, food prices hit an all-time high in February. I would suggest that's probably likely to increase again in March. The prices were already high. We've actually been tracking that for some time. We were already kind of anticipating some issues around food and food prices causing some civil unrest. And now that's being exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. So Russia and Ukraine account for about 30% of wheat exports. Russia, a very important market for fertilizers, oil price well over $100 a barrel. And then historically, when you've had oil prices that high, that's triggered high food prices because of the importance of oil in food supply chains. And we know there's that link between high food prices and civil unrest and political instability. We've seen riots around this in 2008. We had issues in 30 countries: India, Egypt, Indonesia, Uzbekistan. And then in 2011, at least 15 countries had food riots. And when you kind of read around it, potentially you can link those food riots and those food price increases to the Arab Spring, which caused lots of political instability, unrest, and conflict in the Middle East and North Africa, triggering those ongoing conflicts that we're seeing in Libya and Syria. And a lot of those countries that experienced issues in 2008 and 2011 still very reliant on global food system and supply chain, and so they're still very vulnerable to global food prices. Each previous spike we've seen in food prices, looking back, so when you look back to 2008, 2011, they've actually preceded like an extended period of prices, and we don't see that as being any different. If oil price stays, as high as it is, which looks likely at the moment, demand for foods remains high. Supply chains are already stretched from the pandemic recovery. And then also you can add in some climate change elements as well, with more extreme weather events becoming more damaging to crops. We can definitely see some real issues here. And some of the countries that we might highlight would be Egypt, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, Mozambique, and Pakistan, as well as places like Nigeria and Uzbekistan. And that's it from us this week. We hope you found the briefing useful. Thanks very much.